Good evening, campers, dreamers, and babysitters, and welcome to our raw reaction review for Heretic, the latest film from the A24 camp. Yes, this one has gotten some praise over the last few months, specifically from friend of the show, Cody Leach, who got to see this at a festival. I believe it was one of the surprise films for Fantastic Fest. He had a lot of nice things to say about it, and so did many others who walked out of that festival. So I gotta say, the anticipation for Luke and I here was pretty good. We were excited for this one. I mean, Hugh Grant playing some kind of perceived villain in the trailer with kind of this interesting take on Mormon horror in a way. It's very interesting. A lot of things that were definitely piquing what we're really looking for out of, I guess you would say, a change to religious horror. You know, I think that's kind of what we've been preaching a lot this year. We've had some films like Thine Ear Shall Bleed, which have come out, and we're just like, that's really cool. I like this take. This one I was kind of hoping would also hit that spot for us. And Luke, you got to see this on Thursday night, so I just saw it today. How are you feeling about Heretic after sitting with it for just a few days?
Going into it, I was really excited. Like you said, this film was met with a lot of positivity. I heard some glowing reviews going into it, so you're always a little hesitant because you never want to get your hopes up with something like this, and especially mentioning religious horror, and you mentioned Thine Ear Shall Bleed, and that being such a positive experience for religious horror, and seeing a handful of other religious horror this year and not really hitting with us 100%. I was rather intrigued with Heretic because, you look at the formula for religious horror. It usually takes place in a church. Usually you're dealing with a priest or a nun. It's pretty standard stuff, and we're dealing with the devil, this stuff. Heretic looked rather different. It's the settings inside of a home. A lot of questions were raised just from the trailer. I think the trailer was well done, had a great aspect of tension to it. So going into this one, I was really excited to see what they were offering. It's A24. We're always pretty positive about A24 films. And of course, you have Hugh Grant. And Hugh Grant, I can't say that I'm a huge fan of Hugh Grant. It's not something where I rush out to see his films. I've seen maybe a handful, but it's nothing like I think back and say, oh my gosh, what an immaculate performance. But I was excited to see what he was going to do in the horror realm. So going into it, I was rather excited. And I'll say for a lot of this film, I had an anticipation of, oh my gosh, this is easily in my top 10, could break the top 5 from a dialogue perspective alone. And then a couple things didn't hit for me. So it kind of drastically took a turn. Not that it is a bad film. It just, going into it and seeing a lot of anticipation, a lot of positivity, maybe I expected a little bit more through no fault of the film itself, just with a lot of the reviews that I had seen. So I think it's a good film. It's just not a great film.
Yeah, before I really get into my thoughts on this, I think it's proper that we set the stage a little bit here and let you guys know a little bit more about Heretic and the people behind it, because this is a Scott Beck and Brian Woods production. This is another one that they've directed. Now, if those names are familiar to you, but you can't quite pick it up, they are, of course, two of the writers behind A Quiet Place and I believe The Quiet Place Day One. I don't think they wrote Quiet Place 2. But this is also the people who brought us 65, which I know had a lot of people hyped. Didn't quite hit with everybody. They directed and wrote that one. But one that you might not know about, and I am looking for an excuse to talk about it, so I'll use it here, is a film, I believe it was 2018. I can double check for us here, but it's called Haunt, and it's really, really well done. It's a film, 2019, but it's a film that I've really love. It's on Shudder. You should check it out. I think it's one of their best outings. So going in knowing that, I was really excited to see these guys redeem themselves. I was really excited to see them really step it up, especially coming back to the horror realm. Obviously, we know not everybody who plays in horror can really transition into the action kind of crowd pleaser area as much. So 65, yeah, it's okay if that one's more of a miss. But this one for me, I gotta say, I like Luke. 80% of this movie, I'm talking about this being in my top 5 of the year. It's so engaging, it's so unique, it's very enthralling with just the conversations that our characters are having. Hugh Grant is just chewing up scenery left, right, and center in this. I mean, he is a character that you cannot trust, but you also just absolutely adore every second that he's on screen. And I will say his performance throughout the entire runtime of the film never wanes. He is absolute perfection from the first frame he's brought in to the last. And I do got to say that the supporting cast here, we have Sophie Thatcher, who we remember from Boogeyman, which we had a lot of nice things to say about. Funny enough, I guess I should mention that Scott Beck and Brian Woods also penned that one. And then we also have Chloe East, who I'm not super familiar with. This might be the first thing I've seen her in. They also have great chemistry. The three leads here are all excellent with each other. But yeah, they just do something towards the third act of this film that obviously we can't get into, that just kind of feels like we're pulling some punches, and it's just not in the way that I was hoping we would end this.
And shedding light on the performances here, which is really where I think the film excels. I think Hugh Grant, obviously, from the trailer, you were sold on that performance alone. And going through it, he just gives so much to the audience in that. From a dialogue perspective, you feel he believes what he is saying, and that delivery is just so on point. From a verbal standpoint, it is, but from a nonverbal standpoint, he knocks it out of the park. There's where he's delivering dialogue in this, he's bringing up some very interesting points, and I think maybe it can be, I don't know how how a general audience is gonna feel about the subject matter here, because for me, he was bringing up very valid points, and I thought, my gosh, what an engaging piece of dialogue of just these three sitting around talking. And that's very hard to do. We talk about it on the channel a lot here, where there's some smaller films that we see and they're aware of it. So it's just more of in a setting, in one or two settings with a handful of characters that are just delivering dialogue. And you can very easily tune out if that dialogue is not engaging. Hugh Grant's delivery is perfection in this, and those little non-verbal cues that he gives after, just as how he's reacting to what he is saying, you almost smirk at it because of just how well done it is. And then when you look at Sophie Thatcher's Sister Barnes, I think great chemistry with Hugh Grant. There's an element in here where they're speaking and he brings up an interesting point, but then she brings up and pushes back a little bit, and I was like, I really like that she's kind of going head to head in this. And then Sister Paxton, played by Chloe East, is kind of, for the most part, when she's interacting with the other two, it also brings in a different dynamic, more of an innocence to it. And I thought, my gosh, these three are just really working so well off each other and building that tension. And that's what is really most captivating about this film, I think. Yes, we get into those horror elements, which are rather light when we're talking about everything we've seen in the horror space over 2024. But I think really building that tension is really where you're going to get those goosebumps, and you're just going to be super engaged.
Yeah, I would say that this film actually is a really nice blend of tension and levity. You know, like, I think that there are moments that are just so tense and things are building to such a degree. And then we have a joke about Jar Jar Binks just thrown in there. It's like, it sounds like it shouldn't work, but it does. There's a level of just care that is put into these characters for so long. And then something happens in this movie. An event takes place, and you suddenly just feel like they wrote themselves into a corner. And that is one of the most frustrating angles that can happen in any film, any TV show, is when you can kind of sense the writers are struggling to figure out where they're going to go next, because they've set things up, they've implied things, they've taken things off the table, and now we just have to kind of live with it. And I feel like as we get into the final resolutions of this film, Luke had brought up that there's a specific way you could interpret it that is technically, if that's how it is, genius, but it's so light in the sense of leading you that way that it almost feels like maybe we're grasping a little bit. It can be perceived that way. So I gotta be honest here when I say that this is probably 2/3 an amazing film with a very, very lackluster ending.
I would agree with that as well. There's just so much brought in that tension aspect to it. It almost felt like, what are we going to do here to deliver on that horror element to it? And it almost feels like not necessarily shoehorned in, but we almost had to amp it up and try to find a way to meld two pieces together that didn't necessarily fit. When they bring in this element of horror and how they approach it, I'll say I got, I guess, Knives Out feeling to it, where the way we kind of look back on it, it just didn't hit for me. It almost deflates everything just because we're focusing on the wrong thing. Everything, how we set the table and then the meal that we get just does not jive with me, I think, because that first half is just so strong in what they're building, and that the direction for me seems so clear. And even Dylan and I had talked previously before we had recorded of maybe where they could have went with this and how, you know, they could have delivered maybe a little bit better of a meal than what we did get here. And I think it would have meshed a little bit better. Maybe you could have found a piece there that would have felt more natural rather than just trying to deliver on some horror elements. It didn't necessarily work. And a character change for me that just did not feel natural at all. We go from this deer in the headlights to almost an all-seeing, all-knowing, and you know, it was like quite a bit of a jump. It was a little bit jarring to say, where's this information coming from? Where's this kind of voice coming from? It just did not feel natural.
Yeah, and it's definitely one of the bigger oof moments of this movie for me, because it's like everything works so well. And I feel like when we had talked beforehand, the best thing that I can surmise from what I had said earlier was just that it felt like they had to go full force and explain everything and really try to explain how this works, because I think they weren't confident enough to take it into more of a subtle, more subdued angle. They weren't confident enough that I think they needed to go for almost, unfortunately, and as pretentious as this is going to sound, they needed to go into more of a conventional angle for the third act of this movie, where this is very much an A24 film for the first 2/3, because, you know, we're here, everything's working, and then, oh no, we need to, you know, bring this home. We got to wrap this up. So we have to feed you every single thing. So that way there's, you know, only a tiny crumb of maybe this is what's going on, maybe not. When I think working under a studio like A24, attracting an A24 audience, you easily could have taken this into more of like a, you know, a think piece towards the end of this, where you're just sitting back and you're wondering, you know, what does this mean? Could this be real? Is this all actually happening? Or is this, you know, something that was just in the house, in the thing, you know, without getting into spoilers, obviously. I just felt like there was such a lack of confidence there, and it really hurt the movie.
Yeah, I don't want to say it seemed directionless, because they did have an idea of where they wanted to go, but again, it just didn't feel natural. It felt very different from what we got for, like you said, about 80% of this film. And then once we get into that ending portion of it, it just felt like, okay, we really do have to amp up the horror elements here and try to deliver something, where I don't know if they weren't aware, maybe on paper, of how well everything in that 80% was being accomplished. Because if we would have got that last 20% just like we got that 80%, this would have easily been a top 5 film for me, just because of the ground that they cover here. And I love that you earlier mentioned that they kind of deliver this sense of levity, and I think that's what a lot of religious horror might be missing here, where it's not
definitely
it's not necessarily relatable. We're in a church, there's nuns, there's priests. A lot of us cannot relate to that. But when you're mentioning Jar Jar Binks, popular board games, popular songs, and you're bringing that element in here to kind of draw those parallels, I think that's what was so well done here. Of, we know we need to kind of modernize this and show an audience how this relates to everything, because that dialogue, again, I'll go back to it, it's probably some of the best dialogue I've seen in 2024.
It's damn good.
When we're sitting in a living room with 3 characters just speaking, it is just absolutely captivating. more captivating for me than what we get into that last 20% of the film, even though we're moving, it's supposed to be higher tension, fast paced, more conventional horror. But that beginning, that tension that they're building for me was just way more horrific than what we do get by the end of this.
And I think that's something that they really need to take on the chin with this one. Personally, from us, I know a lot of people really like this, and that's great. But for us, I think that they need to understand that the pen is mightier than the sword with them, because honestly, when it's just these characters, like Luke said, in a living room, discussing things, getting uncomfortable, talking about topics that are a bit taboo for certain people who maybe follow certain denominations, it's enthralling, it's exciting, it's everything you want. And there's so much tension and horror that can be built without needing to go that extra mile. And it just feels like this is one of those times where, the best way I can put it, and the last thing I'll say before we get into ratings, is just sometimes, you want some ice cream, but you don't need a sundae. Sometimes I'm good with just my cookies and cream ice cream, and I can walk away without whipped cream and cherries and sprinkles. This is one of those times where you got me with the ice cream. I didn't need the extra.
Absolutely. I think that's the best way to put it. Hey, that works so well for Heretic and its dialogue. I think that is just absolutely perfect. So, I'm right there with you on that one. I think I was so excited for this film. I was so excited in the theater watching this. And then it just took a little bit of a downturn for me. Not necessarily a travesty or anything like that. I don't want people thinking that at all, but it's still an adequate film. It just had the potential to be one of the best of the year. And unfortunately for us, it didn't turn out that way. I'm sitting at a recommend for this one. I think, as a horror fan, I don't know necessarily if you're going in with that hunger. I don't know if it's really going to fulfill you in any sense, because this, I don't know. It's such a mixed bag, I guess, where, yeah, you do get that conventional horror, but it just didn't really satisfy me. I was way happier with what we got in the first 80% of the film. So I think you can find some fun in this. Hugh Grant's performance is tremendous. Sophie Thatcher, again, knocks it out of the park. They all play so well together. I think if you're interested in writing dialogue, being a screenwriter, you certainly have to see Heretic. So I think there's a lot of positive coming out of this film. Just that last little bit does not hit for me, but I'm sitting at a recommend for this one.
And I'm going to go with a worth a watch. This one, again, not a bad rating. Again, we're just saying that with what we had before, it just didn't deliver in that third act for me. And it hurt it so much to where this is one that I may occasionally go back to, but I don't see myself rushing out to pick up on Blu-ray or wanting to really sit down and watch it again. The thing that I'd love to do is honestly just maybe watch those scenes again between our characters. Hugh Grant, of course, like we said, I can't understate it enough. I know everybody's talking about it, but his performance is seriously something to admire this year. I mean, the guy, in my opinion, is Oscar worthy in this role. I know that they love to not give horror films any attention at the Oscars, but he is seriously that good. He really commands the scenes he's in and commands the screen. I absolutely think it's one of the best performances I've ever seen from him. And again, Sophie Thatcher and everybody else, they play off of it so well. It's a film that you can just tell the energy is there. I just wish that the directing and the script writing had a little bit more of that confidence with them. So that's where I sit with it. Again, definitely something I think you should check out if you're interested. Maybe I'm being a bit too picky with it, but hey, that's what you get. I gotta be honest. So alrighty, guys, that's going to wrap us up here for Heretic. Definitely worth checking out if you're interested. Maybe if this swayed you into it, you want to let us know down below so we can see if maybe we steered you in the right direction. But other than that, it has been a bit of a slower week for us here on the channel, but we do have some content all from October, everything, and we do have a lot of fun stuff on the horizon. Lots of stuff. We're coming back big. Needed a little bit of a break. Needed to recharge a little bit, but we're here. And yeah. That's good for us now. So until next time, guys, I'm Dylan Newell.
And I'm Luke Janesco.
And remember, stay scared.
Do the hard shit, gonna do it live. Cause Splattercast kick it every day they live. Splattercast, gonna smash your ass. 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 slash your ass.